Chapter 1. The Street Supper. The village of Thornwick-on-Green had not changed in any meaningful way since the reign of Edward VII, and its inhabitants took considerable pride in that fact. The high street still boasted a chemist, a post office, and a draper's shop with bolts of wool displayed behind glass, so old it had gone slightly green at the corners. The elm trees that lined Maple Street had been planted by the grandfather of a man now himself quite elderly, and the cobblestones underfoot had once felt the wheels of horse-drawn carts carrying milk and coal. It was the second Thursday of October, the date of the annual Maple Street supper, and the air smelled of bonfires and roasted apples. Trestle tables had been dragged out of back gardens and arranged end to end along the pavement, draped in mismatched tablecloths that somehow, or in the kindly glow of paper lanterns, looked almost festive. The residents of Maple Street had been gathering this way for 40 years, rain or shine, and no one could quite remember who had started the tradition, though everyone was certain it had been their own grandmother. Miss Jane Marple sat in the front bay window of number 3, the home of her old friend Mrs. Dorothea Pembleton, and watched the preparations below with the calm, observant pleasure of a naturalist studying a familiar species in its natural habitat. She had arrived that morning on the 10:15 from London, and Mrs. Pembleton, who was suffering from a stiff knee and a great deal of cheerfulness about it, had insisted that Miss Marple rest in the parlour window while the neighbours assembled outside. "You'll see everyone from here," Mrs. Pembleton had said, without needing to stand on those cold cobblestones. She had brought tea and a plate of shortbread and settled into the chair opposite, narrating the passing neighbours with the easy authority of a woman who had watched them all for 30 years. Miss Marple had listened, and knitted, and looked. She noted Mrs. Dolly Fenn of number 11, a stout, warm-faced woman in a burgundy cardigan, carrying a large covered dish with the careful reverence of someone bearing something fragile and precious. Behind her came her daughter, a sullen girl of 17 carrying the dessert, a magnificent walnut cake on a white stand, its icing pale and smooth as new plaster. Miss Marple had admired it from across the street. She noted Dr. Leonard Ashby of number 14, retired now for several years, who walked slowly with a stick but held himself very straight. He was a neat, dry little man with grey at his temples, and a way of surveying the world through half-lidded eyes that gave him the look of a very alert tortoise. He stopped to speak to no one, but observed everyone. She noted young Peter Vane, who had arrived that afternoon by motor from somewhere north, and who was presently leaning against the lamp-post outside number 9, smoking in the studied, careless way of young men who have recently learned to be careless. He was perhaps 24, with restless hands and a quality of suppressed impatience that reminded Miss Marple of a wound clock spring. And she noted, last and most carefully, Miss Irene Clay, of number 5, who had come out in a dark green evening dress quite unsuitably glamorous for a street supper in October, and who wore upon her left hand a small but unmistakable sapphire ring. She was perhaps 40, handsome in a fine-boned, slightly faded way, and she moved among the neighbours with the particular grace of someone who is accustomed to being watched. "Who is Miss Clay?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Pembleton lowered her teacup. "A newcomer, really. Only been on the street about 2 years. Keeps herself to herself, largely. Mr. Holt at number 7 is apparently very fond of her." She paused with a knowing compression of the lips. "Very fond." Mr. Cedric Holt of number 7. Miss Marple had not yet seen him. She noted the absence. It was at 7:30, when the soup had been served and the bread was going round, that someone noticed the armchair in the front window of number 7, visible through the glass, and the figure seated in it that had not moved in rather a long time. Young Peter Vane, who had a clear view from the lamp-post, went first, tapping on the window and then trying the door. It was not locked. He came back out at a dead run. The walnut cake, Miss Marple thought, sat entirely untouched at the far end of the table, and the smell of bitter almonds, she was almost certain, had reached her even from across the street. Chapter 2. Number 7. Maple Street. The inside of number 7 was exactly the sort of house that reveals its occupant's character with almost indiscreet thoroughness. It was comfortable to the point of smugness. The carpets were thick and dark, the chairs upholstered in leather that had gone brown with age, the walls hung with sporting prints, and a single large painting of a Scottish loch in a heavy gilt frame. There were decanters on the sideboard, 3 of them, and a silver cigarette box on the mantelpiece beside a carriage clock. Everything spoke of money that had been inherited rather than earned. Mr. Cedric Holt sat in his armchair by the fire as if he had simply fallen asleep there, which in a sense he had. He was a large man in his late 50s, well-fed and florid, with the kind of face that had been red-cheeked and authoritative in his youth and had become merely inflated in age. His hands rested on the chair arms with a quality of final stillness. On the small table beside him, a half-empty crystal glass with the remains of brandy, and a small plate on which sat a slice of walnut cake, one corner bitten away. Inspector Thomas Crane of the Thornwick Constabulary arrived at 8 o'clock precisely, having been telephoned by young Peter Vane. He was a large, well-meaning man in late middle age, with a pink face and the general demeanour of a retired sergeant major who has found peacetime agreeable. He made notes, asked the same questions several times in slightly different words, and arrived with considerable satisfaction at an early conclusion: the walnut cake. "Poisoned," he announced to the small crowd gathered outside number 7, with the confidence of a man who has solved a thing he has not yet examined. Bitter almonds, classic cyanide, that cake. He looked at Mrs. Dolly Fenn, who had gone the colour of the old tallow. "Your cake, Mrs. Fenn, if I'm not mistaken." I wouldn't," Mrs. Fenn began, and then, with the instinct of someone who knows that protest looks like guilt, she fell silent and simply looked wretched. Teased Miss Marple, who had been permitted inside by the simple expedient of arriving quietly, and standing near enough to the proceedings to be considered part of them, looked at the brandy glass on the table beside the deceased. Then she looked at the cake. The cake had been bitten, yes, and Mr. Holt had not finished it. But the brandy glass was nearly empty, and the particular sweet almondine smell that lingered in the room was, she thought, rather concentrated near the sideboard. She crossed to it with the unhurried movement of an elderly woman stretching her legs, and bent slightly, her eyesight was still quite good, to examine the nearest decanter. The stopper had been replaced, but not seated quite straight. Inspector Crane was still talking about the cake. Behind him, Dr. Ashby had entered the room and was standing at the periphery. Watching the proceedings with the careful blankness of a man controlling his expression very precisely, Miss Marple watched him for a moment. Then she noticed the umbrella. It stood in the hall stand near the front door. A woman's umbrella, dark navy, wet at the ferrule and damp halfway up the canopy, as if it had been recently carried through moisture but quickly closed. The stand already contained 3 umbrellas belonging to Mr. Holt, a walking stick, a large golfing brolly, and a compact town umbrella in black. The 4th was slender and out of place. Miss Marple looked at the window. The sky was quite clear. The stars were out. It had not rained in Thornwick-on-Green for 4 days. She said nothing. She returned to the window and looked at the fireplace mantel. The carriage clock ticked. Beside it sat a small stack of papers. And tucked behind the clock, not quite hidden, but not quite visible unless one were the right height and looking at the right angle, was a torn page, its edges rough, its paper yellowed. She did not touch it, but she could see from where she stood that it bore columns of numbers and names of coastal locations. A tide table from an almanac. She folded her hands and looked quite thoughtful indeed. "Sad business," said Mrs. Pembleton from the doorway, who had limped across after all. "Poor man." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though I suspect considerably less poor than most of his tenants would have wished." She smiled pleasantly at nothing in particular. "Will you go back in? I think I shall stay just a little longer." Chapter 3. The Four Who Might Have. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, the most useful thing one could do in the immediate aftermath of a suspicious death was to let other people talk. There was always a great deal of talking in such circumstances. Nerves, shock, the essentially social impulse to process horror through conversation, and a quiet elderly woman with knitting was, she had found, almost entirely invisible to people caught up in the urgency of their own narratives. She settled herself in Mrs. Pembleton's parlour the following morning with a cup of tea and 4 persons' worth of recently acquired intelligence, and considered each in turn. Mrs. Dolly Fenn first, since she was the obvious suspect, which in Miss Marple's experience was generally the strongest argument against her having done it. Mrs. Fenn had lived at number 11 Maple Street for 23 years. She had raised 2 children there, buried a husband, kept a garden that was the envy of the street every June, and baked walnut cake for the street supper for at least a decade. She was facing eviction. Mr. Holt had informed her 3 weeks earlier that he intended to redevelop numbers 9 through 13, and her lease, of the particularly ungenerous sort that Mr. Holt favoured, offered no meaningful protection. She had neither the money to fight it, nor, at 62 with a bad hip, anywhere obvious to go. Motive. Clear. Means. The cake was undeniably hers. Opportunity. She had carried it to the table herself, and yet the cake had been only one bite taken. Mr. Holt had been in his armchair. The smell of cyanide was at the sideboard, not at the table. A woman who had poisoned a cake and left it at the street supper for general consumption, which is to say, for other people to eat as well, was either a murderer of spectacular recklessness or not the murderer at all. Dr. Leonard Ashby next. He had retired from general practice 9 years ago, under circumstances that Mrs. Pembleton, when gently prompted, described as some bother about records, I believe, but nobody liked to ask. He had come to Maple Street 6 years ago, renting number 14 from Mr. Holt at a rate that had risen, by all accounts, steadily and without mercy every 18 months. He had the knowledge, beyond question. A retired physician understood pharmacology with a precision that made most poisoners look amateurish. He had means. Access to compounds through old medical channels was not, in Miss Marple's experience, as impossible as people imagined. And there was the matter of what he knew about Cedric Holt. Mrs. Pembleton had mentioned it only in passing, but Miss Marple had filed it carefully. Ashby had been Holt's physician before retiring, and there had been an insurance claim some years back. A fire at one of Holt's properties, a settlement paid, that had been, according to the village's collective memory, not entirely above board. Young Peter Vane, Cedric Holt's nephew by his late sister. He stood to inherit the whole of the Holt estate by the terms of a will drawn up 4 years ago, provided his uncle died unmarried and intestate under the original arrangement. A new will, or a marriage, would change everything. Peter had arrived that afternoon from Sheffield, ostensibly for the street supper. He had telephoned twice in the past fortnight, according to the housekeeper at number 7, and both calls had ended badly. And then Miss Irene Clay. The sapphire ring on her left hand, the green dress, the way she had moved among the neighbours with the particular ease of a woman who expects to belong somewhere, and is waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. If Irene Clay had been secretly engaged to Cedric Holt, or secretly married, she stood to inherit rather a great deal, and if a marriage had been planned imminently, the window for anyone else to act was closing. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea and picked up her knitting. The pattern was a complicated one, a cable stitch that required attention, but her hands moved automatically while her mind worked elsewhere, which was, she had always found, exactly the right way to think. Chapter 4. What the Almanac Knew. Miss Marple returned to number 7 the following morning under the entirely legitimate pretext of delivering, on behalf of Mrs. Pembleton, a covered dish of leftover parkin to the housekeeper, a thin, competent woman named Mrs. Rudge, who had served Mr. Holt for 11 years and was presently in a state of organised grief. Very busy, very composed, and waiting, one felt, for the moment when she could be neither. Inspector Crane had sealed the study and the front parlour. The hallway and kitchen were accessible. Mrs. Rudge accepted the parkin with genuine gratitude and made tea, and Miss Marple, as if acting under some vague social compulsion, stayed to drink it at the kitchen table. "Did Mr. Holt have many visitors yesterday?" Miss Marple asked. "Before the supper, I mean." Mrs. Rudge considered this. "The postman in the morning. Mr. Vane telephoned at noon. I took the message myself, and Miss Clay came at around 3. Miss Clay? Of number? 5. Yes. She came in through the back garden, as she often did. Mr. Holt had given her the garden gate key. She came in, and they were together in the parlour perhaps an hour. I brought tea." A pause. "She left at 4 or thereabouts. Through the front this time, which I noticed because she usually went back the way she came." "Did she carry anything when she arrived?" "Her bag, as always. A large handbag, navy blue." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Mrs. Rudge, was there a spare key to the garden shed? I only asked because I noticed the shed door was slightly ajar when I walked up the side passage just now." Mrs. Rudge frowned. "There are 2 keys. Mr. Holt kept one on the hook in the scullery. The other was—" She stopped. "I'm not certain where the other is now you mention it." "I haven't needed it." Miss Marple excused herself shortly afterward and made her way through the kitchen passage into the back garden. It was a damp morning, the grass still beaded with last night's dew. The shed door was indeed slightly ajar, not with the casualness of negligence, but with the precision of something opened carefully and not quite fully pulled to. Inside, terracotta pots, a rusted trowel, a coiled hose, and in the soft dirt of the floor near the entrance, the clear, undeniable impression of a woman's heel, a narrow one, pointed, slightly sunk as if the wearer had stood still for some time. The soil was damp, not from rain, from the hose, she suspected, coiled nearby and dripping slightly at the head. Damp enough to press an impression cleanly. She looked at the umbrella in her mind's eye. Navy blue, wet at the ferrule and halfway up. A woman had stood in this shed for some time, holding an umbrella in soil damp enough to make it wet. She had then passed through the back garden gate into the house. She had left through the front door. The almanac page was the second matter. Miss Marple had seen enough of it the evening before to know what it contained, and this morning, while Mrs. Rudge brewed tea, she had confirmed through the study window, left uncurtained, that it was still behind the clock and that it appeared to be a tide table for the coast north of Thornwick. Irene Clay had claimed, at the street supper, to have been away for 3 days last week, visiting her sister in Whitby, she had said, which was coastal. Miss Marple had heard her say so because Miss Clay had said it rather deliberately to Mrs. Fenn, and Miss Marple had been standing close enough to notice the deliberateness. A tide table, tucked behind a clock in the house of the man you were visiting secretly, the afternoon before he died, was either entirely innocent or it was the ghost of a fabricated alibi, a piece of evidence placed where it might be found and misunderstood, or found and correctly understood, depending on how one held it up to the light. Miss Marple walked back through the garden and stopped to examine, at the base of the garden shed wall, the soil near the door. There, half buried in the damp earth, she saw the glint of metal, small, flat, slightly tarnished. She did not touch it. She looked at it for a long moment. A key. Cut differently from the household type. A duplicate. She would remember exactly where it was. And Chapter 5. The left hand. The Thornwick Arms had not changed its interior decor since approximately 1947, and made no apologies for this. The walls were panelled in dark wood, the settles were hard, and the fire was sufficient without being generous. It was, in other words, the ideal public house, and Miss Marple approved of it entirely. She had come for lunch. The lamb stew was recommended by Mrs. Pembleton, with the authority of long experience. But she had also come because Dr. Leonard Ashby ate lunch at the Thornwick Arms every Tuesday and Friday, and this was a Friday. He was already at his usual table by the window when she arrived, and he rose, quite correctly, when she approached, and expressed neither surprise nor discomfort at her request to share the table. They were acquainted. He had met her once at Mrs. and Pembleton's some years before, and he greeted her with the composed civility of a man who has decided, in advance of any specific threat, to be civil. They discussed the weather, which had been autumnal. They discussed Mrs. Pembleton's knee, which was improving. They discussed the late Mr. Holt, whom Dr. Ashby described without detectable emotion as a man of considerable business acumen and unreliable personal ethics, which Miss Marple considered a usefully candid assessment. "You were his physician for some years, I believe," she said. "Until my retirement, yes. He saw Dr. Haynes after that, I believe. I couldn't say." "And you were at the supper last evening. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Holt's condition earlier in the day? I only ask," she added pleasantly, "because you are a medical man. And medical men notice things." "I didn't see Holt yesterday. Hadn't spoken to him in several weeks," Miss Marple nodded. "I only wondered, because I noticed at the supper, before the alarm was raised, that is, that you poured your tea left-handed. And yet I recall, when we met at Dorothea's 3 years ago, you were quite distinctly right-handed. I noticed because you were doing the crossword and you held the pen in your right hand throughout." There was a pause. A small pause, but a pause with quality in it. The kind that contains a rapid internal calculation. "Old injury," Ashby said. "A sprain. Still gives me trouble in cold weather." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "How uncomfortable. Do you find the autumn particularly troublesome, or the winter more so?" "October is generally the worst," he said, and then, as if hearing himself, on took a slow sip of his beer. Miss Marple said nothing. She applied herself to her stew, which was excellent. She was thinking about what a left-handed teapour meant, and what it might mean if it were not a habit but a performance. The deliberate display of an inconvenience intended to suggest a limitation. A man who could not comfortably use his right hand could not, by extension, be expected to have performed certain actions that required precision and steadiness. The careful removal of a decanter stopper, the introduction of a measured quantity of a substance, the replacement of the stopper at a slight angle not quite true. Such a man would wish it noted in the memory of any witness present that his right hand was compromised. It was, Miss Marple thought, rather too neat. Neat in the way of a person who had planned, and whose plan had been made under stress, and therefore carried one small unnecessary flourish. She had seen the same thing in St. Mary Mead in 1952, when the churchwarden's wife had worn a sling to her husband's funeral. Not because her arm was broken, as she claimed, but because she had, the week before, left a clear set of fingerprints on a preserving jar that she afterwards wished no one to think she had the dexterity to open. The principle was identical. The details differed. Miss Marple thanked Dr. Ashby for his company, paid for her own lunch, she was always firm on this, and walked back to Mrs. Pembleton's through the market square, arriving home in time for tea and thinking as she went. About brandy decanters and the question of who had access to a house through which at least 2 different people might have moved on the afternoon before the street supper. Chapter 6. Peter at the Lamp-Post. Peter Vane was not, in Miss Marple's assessment, a stupid young man, which made his being in the wrong place at the wrong time considerably more interesting. Stupid people ended up in the wrong place through inattention. Clever young men ended up there for reasons. She found him the following morning at the far end of Maple Street, sitting on the stone wall beside the churchyard gate with a cigarette and the expression of a man who is waiting for something, but is trying to look as though he is not. He was dressed differently from the evening before, more carefully, a good wool coat, and his restless hands were still today with the deliberate patience of effort. Miss Marple asked if she might rest for a moment. Her ankle, she explained vaguely, and he made room on the wall with the automatic courtesy of someone raised properly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, looking at the churchyard elms. "You were fond of your uncle?" Miss Marple asked. Peter considered this with an honesty she found rather likeable. "Not particularly. He wasn't a fond sort of man. I respected him in a way. He was competent. He made money and kept it, which is harder than it looks." A pause. "He was rather awful to his tenants. Mrs. Fenn, for instance." "Mrs. Fenn, yes. And the Harpers at number 9 and old Mr. Gillespie who used to be at number 13 until last spring. My uncle viewed property as a mechanism for extracting money from people who had less of it. It was his particular talent." He said this without notable bitterness, with the tone of a surveyor describing elevation. "Did you know about Miss Clay?" The stilled hands were still. "I knew there was someone. I didn't know her name until I came down yesterday and people started talking." "And does it matter? For the will, I mean." He turned and looked at her with the quick, alert recognition of someone realizing that the elderly woman beside them is not, in fact, simply resting her ankle. "You're Mrs. Pembleton's friend, the one from London." "From St. Mary Mead, originally," Miss Marple said pleasantly. He considered her for a moment. "Yes," he said at last, "it matters. Uncle Cedric's will as it stands leaves everything to me. It was drawn up before Miss Clay, I suppose. If he married, he would have changed it. He told me so himself last month on the telephone. He said he was considering his position, which was his way of telling me I might want to adjust my expectations." "And did you?" "I'm 24 and I work as a surveyor's assistant in Sheffield," Peter said, with a dry sort of humour. "My expectations are modest. But yes, naturally it was a consideration." "When did you arrive yesterday?" "The 2:15 train. I was on Maple Street by 3:30. "And you went directly to number 7. A fractional hesitation. "I went past number 7 first, yes. I knocked. Mrs. Rudge said Uncle Cedric was occupied and not to be disturbed. He had a visitor." He paused. "A woman's voice inside. I didn't go in." "So you went to the lamp-post," Miss Marple said. "And waited. I was thinking about what I wanted to say to him. Did Miss Clay leave before or after you arrived at the lamp-post?" Another pause, longer. "After. She came out the front door at about 4. She looked," he searched for the word, "settled, as if something had been decided." "Was she carrying anything?" "Her bag. Large navy one. She was carrying it differently than when I'd seen her come in from the back garden earlier. I could see the garden gate from the street. When she arrived, she was carrying it in the crook of her arm. When she left, she was holding the handles in her fist like it was lighter." Miss Marple looked at the churchyard elms, whose leaves were coming down steadily in the morning breeze. "You have a surveyor's eye for detail," she said. "That is very useful." "Is it?" Peter asked, and he sounded cautious and young. "It may be," Miss Marple said. "Rather more useful than you know." Chapter 7. The Sapphire Ring. Miss Irene Clay received visitors in the ground-floor sitting room of number 5, which she had decorated in the style of someone who had excellent taste and a limited budget, and had reconciled these two things with considerable ingenuity. Good fabric in small quantities, a single, decent watercolour above the mantelpiece, and fresh chrysanthemums in a plain glass vase. The overall effect was of composed, effortless elegance, which was precisely the effect intended. She was, Miss Marple had established through the gentle intelligence gathering of village conversation, the daughter of a Derbyshire solicitor, educated adequately if not brilliantly, possessed of some small independent income, and now in her early 40s. She had come to Thornwick-on-Green 2 years ago from Kensington, and her relationship with Mr. Holt had been, in the local consciousness, simultaneously an open secret and a source of elaborate collective discretion. Miss Marple arrived at 11, carrying a small pot of honey from Mrs. Pembleton's kitchen as the social currency of neighbourly introduction, and was received with the smooth courtesy of a woman who has decided not to be caught off guard by anything. "You are a friend of Cedric's?" Irene Clay asked, pouring coffee with a steady hand. "I was not acquainted with him, I'm afraid. I'm Mrs. Pembleton's guest. We're old friends from my village. I came partly to pay my respects as a neighbour for the week, and partly because—" Miss Marple smiled with the slightly apologetic vagueness that she had found, over many decades, to be entirely disarming. "I confess I wanted to see how you were. It must be dreadful. I understand you were very close." Irene Clay looked at her coffee. "We were to be married," she said, and there was in her voice something that sounded like genuine grief, a dry, private kind, not the public damp sort. "In February. It was all quite settled." "Then I am very sorry," Miss Marple said, and meant it. "The police seem to think it was Mrs. Fenn's cake." Irene's voice became cooler. "I find that difficult to believe. Dolly Fenn is not. She is not that sort of woman." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "though I gather Inspector Crane has formed a view." "Inspector Crane," Irene said with restrained precision, "has a view the size of a postage stamp and the flexibility of concrete." She caught herself. "Forgive me, I'm not at my most gracious." "You are grieving," Miss Marple said simply. "Tell me about your visit to number 7 yesterday afternoon, if you don't mind. I ask only because I want to understand. For Mrs. Pembleton's sake, really. She worries." Irene was quiet for a moment. "I went at 3 o'clock, through the garden gate, as usual. Cedric was in good spirits. We talked about the wedding arrangements, the venue, the date. I left at 4. "Through the front door." "Yes. I was going to the draper's on the high street before it closed. The back route is longer." "And your bag? I couldn't help noticing. You carry a rather large one." "Almost like a carryall." Irene Clay set down her coffee cup with a softness that was more controlled than natural. "I always carry a large bag. Women of my age accumulate necessities." "Quite," said Miss Marple. She looked at the sapphire ring on Irene's left hand, which caught the autumn light from the window with a clear, cool brilliance. "That is a beautiful ring. A recent gift? 3 weeks ago?" And here something flickered in Irene Clay's eyes. Not sadness and not guilt precisely, but something between the two. A complicated, private thing that a less attentive observer would have missed entirely. Miss Marple finished her coffee and thanked Miss Clay warmly for her time. She descended the front steps of number 5 and paused on the pavement, looking at the low grey sky thoughtfully. 3 weeks. The ring was 3 weeks old. And the eviction notices to Mrs. Fenn and the others had been delivered approximately 3 weeks ago. A man who has just proposed marriage is in a particular state of mind. Generous, expansive, newly invested in the future. He would be inclined, at such a moment, to make arrangements. Financial arrangements. Arrangements that depended on his continued good health. And a woman who had accepted such a proposal, Miss Marple thought, who had worn the ring for 3 weeks and begun planning a February wedding, stood to inherit a very great deal, unless, of course, those plans were made contingent on something. Something she had not yet quite obtained. She walked back toward number 3 at a thoughtful pace, her steps unhurried, her expression pleasant and unreadable. Chapter 8. The Chemistry of Things. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in the Thornwick Public Library, which was housed in a Victorian building on Church Lane, and smelled of old bindings and mild damp, and the particular silence of a place that takes books seriously. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman of 50, was the kind who knew exactly where everything was, and asked no unnecessary questions, which Miss Marple appreciated. She read for 2 hours in the reference section, not the crime reports in the local newspaper archive, as Inspector Crane was presumably doing, but the more prosaic matter of the Thornwick Property Register, cross-reference with a volume on coastal almanacs of the northern counties. The Property Register confirmed what she had already pieced together. Cedric Holt owned, outright, 7 properties on Maple Street and 4 more on Church Road, plus 2 commercial premises in the High Street. He held long leases on 3 further residential properties. His estate, Miss Marple estimated with the quiet domestic arithmetic of a woman who had understood money in all its forms since childhood, was worth something in the region of £40,000 to £50,000, a significant sum in any decade, and in this one sufficient to entirely transform the circumstances of anyone who received it. The coastal almanac question was simpler. She asked the librarian, obliquely, as a curious reader rather than an investigator, whether almanacs with tide tables for the Yorkshire coast were commonly available in Thornwick. The librarian said there was one bookseller on the High Street that stocked them for the fishing enthusiasts, and that they were the kind of thing people sometimes tore pages from to keep in their pockets for specific dates. Miss Marple thought about the torn page behind the clock. Torn, not cut. The edge was ragged in the way of a page removed in haste, or removed with one hand while holding the almanac awkwardly. The page had contained, as best she could see through the study window, tide tables for the coast between Scarborough and Whitby. Irene Clay had claimed to have visited Whitby last week. A person establishing an alibi, or more precisely a person preparing a false alibi for a period that had not yet occurred, might plant evidence of their intended story in advance. The almanac page said, "I was near the coast, I was planning to be near the coast, here is a document that places me at a distance from Thornwick." But placed behind a clock in the dead man's house rather than in one's own, it was evidence only of having been in that house, which was the one place the alibi was meant to contradict. It was, Miss Marple thought, a plan made in hurry. Not badly made, quite cleverly made, but with the characteristic flaw of plans made under the pressure of changed circumstances. Something had shifted recently. Something had made action suddenly necessary where patience had previously served. She returned to Mrs. Pembleton's at 4 and found a note on the hall table. Inspector Crane had announced, according to village intelligence relayed through Mrs. Pembleton's kitchen window via Mrs. Fenn's daughter, that Mrs. Dolly Fenn was to be brought in for questioning tomorrow morning. Miss Marple set the note down and stood for a moment in the hall, thinking about innocent women and the machinery of obvious conclusions, and about potassium cyanide, which is both readily soluble and in brandy, given the strong natural sugars and the warmth of a fire, almost entirely undetectable by taste until it is too late. She thought about a large navy handbag carried differently upon arrival than upon departure. She thought about a shed with damp soil and a missing key. She thought about left-handed tea pouring, and young men watching from lampposts, and sapphire rings given at exactly the moment when everything was about to change. She went upstairs, changed her shoes, came back down, and asked Mrs. Pembleton if she might use the telephone. Chapter 9. What Mrs. Rudge remembered. Mrs. Rudge was a woman who had survived 11 years in the service of Cedric Holt by developing an exceptional memory and an equally exceptional discretion. She remembered everything, disclosed nothing, and had the quiet authority of a person who has, in the course of daily life, become the institutional memory of a household. She agreed to speak to Miss Marple on Saturday afternoon, in the kitchen of number 7, which was now under the nominal oversight of Inspector Crane's constable, but practically under the continued governance of Mrs. Rudge, who had put a ham on to boil and was making efficient use of the hours regardless. Miss Marple came to the point rather more directly than was her usual custom, because she judged that Mrs. Rudge would appreciate directness. The decanter on the sideboard, Mr. Holt's brandy, was it a new bottle? Recently filled, Mrs. Rudge set down her spoon. Refilled Thursday morning. I filled it myself from the cellar stock. And between Thursday morning and the evening supper, who was in the parlour? I was, briefly, when I brought in the Morning Post, Mr. Holt himself during the afternoon, and Miss Clay, of course, from 3 to 4, a pause, and Dr. Ashby. Miss Marple was very still. Dr. Ashby came. At 1:30. I should have mentioned it before. It slipped my mind in all the confusion. He stayed perhaps 20 minutes. Mr. Holt received him in the parlour. I heard them talking. Rather intensely, I thought, but I didn't listen. It wasn't my place. Was Mr. Holt's mood changed after Dr. Ashby left? Mrs. Rudge considered. Quieter, she said at last. He came to the kitchen and asked for a brandy at 2:00, which was early for him. He wasn't a daytime drinker as a rule. I poured it from the same decanter, she paused. He didn't finish it. Miss Marple absorbed this. Ashby had been there at 1:30. The decanter had been freshly filled that morning. If Ashby had introduced something to the decanter during his visit, when, given the layout of the room, Mr. Holt might have stepped out briefly, then the brandy Holt had asked for at 2:00 would already have been compromised. The fact that Holt had not finished that glass and had survived until the evening's fatal glass suggested either that the dose had not been sufficient in the early glass, or that— "How much was in the glass he brought back to you?" Miss Marple asked. "Nearly full." He'd barely sipped it. Or that the first glass had been merely a test of his health, a coincidence, and the later glass had been the one, which meant the brandy had been dosed at some point after 2:00, after Ashby had left, after the early afternoon glass had been replaced in the decanter, unremarkable. Between 2:00 and 3:30, only Holt himself had been in the parlour. Between 3:30 and 4:00, Miss Clay. "One more thing," Miss Marple said. "When Miss Clay arrived through the garden, did she come directly inside, or did she stop anywhere in the garden first?" Mrs. Rudge looked at her with the clear-eyed calm of a woman who has already asked herself this question and knows the answer. "She was perhaps 5 minutes coming from the gate to the back door. The path is short. It should have taken one." Miss Marple stood and thanked Mrs. Rudge with sincere warmth. She walked back through the kitchen passage into the hall and stopped again at the umbrella stand. The navy umbrella was still there. She looked at it carefully, the pattern of dampness on the canopy, dry at the top and wet at the ferrule and mid-shaft. The pattern of an umbrella closed over a wet object, not carried open in rain. An umbrella used to transport something damp, something carried from a shed with wet soil. She knew where the duplicate key had been. She knew who had put it back. Chapter 10. 2 persons, 1 plan. The thing that made this case, in Miss Marple's view, particularly careful and interesting was that it had been designed to look like 2 separate people might have done it, either of whom was a credible suspect. This was not, and in her experience the architecture of 1 plan, it was the architecture of 2 plans that had collided. Dr. Ashby had his plan. It had been forming for some time, the methodical, careful plan of a retired physician, with access to specific knowledge and specific grievances, and who had the patience, she suspected, of a man who has waited years already. He had obtained a duplicate key to number 7, made perhaps on a day when he was still Holt's physician, and house calls were routine. He had the pharmacological knowledge to know that potassium cyanide in brandy would work quickly and leave, in a victim of Holt's colouring and known tendency to drink, an initial impression of cardiac failure. He had arranged to visit Holt at 1:30, an innocent social call the kind retired neighbours make, and he had used that visit, e.g. in the moment when Holt was called away by Mrs. Rudge with a message to approach the sideboard. But here was where it became interesting. Something had stopped him. Perhaps Holt had returned too quickly. Perhaps the phone rang. Perhaps nerves, even very cold nerves, had not quite served him at the critical moment. He had poured his own tea left-handed to establish, for whatever audience there might later be, that his right hand was unreliable. He had left the house at 10 to 2, having introduced a small amount of the compound, not a fatal dose, as subsequent events showed, to the decanter, or having in fact failed to do so at all. The ambiguity nagged at Miss Marple, because Miss Irene Clay had also had a plan, and her plan was rather more recently made. The sapphire ring, 3 weeks old, represented a change in Holt's intentions. He was committed to her. He had spoken of the February wedding, the changed will, the secure future. She had accepted all of this and planned, as women in her position have planned through all of recorded history, for the contingency in which those promises were kept. A married woman inherits. An unmarried companion inherits nothing, regardless of sapphire rings. But something had changed last week. Miss Marple had deduced this from the convergence of dates, the eviction notices, the ring, and she'd confirmed this through a careful conversation with the solicitor's clerk in the High Street. He approached under the pretext of a question about property leases. The fact that Holt had visited his solicitor 8 days ago to begin the process of revising his will. Not to include Irene Clay. To exclude Peter Vane, yes. But the new primary beneficiary the clerk had let slip was a charitable trust for the preservation of rural properties. Holt had been, apparently, having second thoughts. About the wedding, about the will, about everything. This sapphire ring had brought him conviction for approximately a fortnight. And then something, a letter, a conversation, perhaps merely the private arithmetic of a man contemplating his estate, had introduced doubt. Irene Clay had found out. How, Miss Marple was not entirely certain. Perhaps through the solicitor's clerk, who was young and talkative. Perhaps through Holt himself, who had been quieter after Ashby's visit and may have said something unguarded. Either way, she had understood that the February wedding was becoming uncertain, and that an uncertain wedding meant no inheritance at all. Her plan, therefore, was rapid and decisive where Ashby's had been measured and deliberate. She had come through the garden gate on Thursday afternoon, stopped in the shed to retrieve from beneath the loose board where she had hidden it the small glass vial acquired through channels Miss Marple preferred not to speculate about in detail. The umbrella had been her carrier, or rather its handle cup, a small retaining well at the ferrule end where moisture collected, sufficient to carry a sealed vial without detection. She had gone in, sat with Holt for an hour, had discussed the wedding with the composed determination of a woman who had already made her decision, and in the moment when Mrs. Rudge brought the tea and Holt was distracted, she had done what she came to do. The almanac page was either a deliberate planting, a detail to muddy the timeline, or simply something she had had in her bag and had slipped behind the clock thoughtlessly, a nervous gesture in a nervous moment. Either way, the duplicate key, pressed into the soil of the shed floor when she dropped it on her way out, confirmed where it had come from and who had used it. Miss Marple sat with this complete picture for a long time in the quiet of Mrs. Pembleton's parlour, and felt, as she always felt at this stage, not satisfaction but a kind of sorrow. The clean cold sorrow of understanding exactly how something dreadful had happened. Chapter 11. The Quiet Confrontation. Miss Marple sent word to Inspector Crane that she would like to speak with him at Mrs. Pembleton's house on Sunday morning, if it was convenient, and that she had information pertaining to the death of Mr. Holt, which she believed would be of some interest. Crane arrived at 10 o'clock with the cautious scepticism of a man who has learned to be polite to old women without expecting to learn anything from them. He accepted tea, took the armchair offered, and arranged his face into the expression of patient courtesy. Miss Marple told him everything. She told him in the particular order that was most likely to be followed, which was not the order in which she had discovered it, but the order in which it formed a complete and unambiguous chain. She began with the umbrella, wet on a dry day, proceeded through the duplicate key in the shed soil, the pattern of damp on the canopy, Mrs. Rudge's evidence about the afternoon timeline, the large bag carried differently upon departure than arrival, the almanac page as a nervous gesture rather than a deliberate plant, and the sapphire ring, the solicitor's visit 8 days prior, and the essential question of what Irene Clay stood to lose if the February wedding was cancelled. She addressed Dr. Ashby secondly. The left-handed tea pour as a false performance, the medical knowledge, the visit at 1:30, and the conclusion, which she offered with appropriate tentativeness, that Ashby had either lost his nerve or been interrupted, and that his attempt, if any, had been insufficient. The fatal dose had been delivered later by a different hand. Inspector Crane, to his considerable credit, listened without interrupting. He made notes. He frowned at certain points, but the frown was engaged rather than dismissive. When she finished, he sat for a moment. "The key in the shed," he said. "We hadn't found that." "It is pressed into the soil near the base of the left doorpost," Miss Marple said. "I thought it best not to disturb it." "And the umbrella? We assumed it was Holt's." "It is a woman's umbrella. The shaft is narrow. Holt's 3 umbrellas are all quite substantial." Crane nodded slowly. "I owe Mrs. Fenn an apology," he said, and the directness of this admission elevated him considerably in Miss Marple's estimation. "I think you do," she agreed kindly. "She baked an excellent cake." Crane went away with his notes and a revised understanding of Thursday afternoon, and Miss Marple sat for a moment in the quiet parlour. She thought about what must come next. The confrontation with Irene Clay, the forensic examination of the decanter, the question of what Ashby had or had not actually done, and felt the familiar weight of these things. It was at this point that she did something that might have surprised those who knew her only by reputation. She asked Mrs. Pembleton to invite Irene Clay to tea, not to accuse her, not in the style of a dramatic revelation. Miss Marple had no love of theatrical unmasking. She found it vulgar, and in any case dangerous. Cornered people made rash choices. She asked Irene Clay to tea because she wanted to see one final time whether she had understood the woman correctly, whether there was, underneath the composure and the green dress and the sapphire ring, the thing that she suspected was there, not a cold and empty criminal, but a frightened person who had made a terrible calculation and committed an act that now sat, Miss Marple imagined, in her chest like swallowed glass. Irene Clay arrived at 3:30. She sat in the chair opposite and accepted her tea, and for a few minutes they talked about Thornwick-on-Green in autumn, and Mrs. Pembleton's knee, and the chrysanthemums in the window box. Then Miss Marple set down her cup and looked at her, and Irene Clay looked back. "I know," Miss Marple said, very quietly. The silence that followed was the longest of the afternoon. "I see," said Irene Clay at last. Her voice was quite steady. She looked at her coffee, then out of the window at Maple Street, where the elm trees were nearly bare now and the last of the leaves were coming down in the grey October wind. "Will you tell them?" "I already have," Miss Marple said. Irene Clay put down her teacup and placed her hands flat on the table, very still. "The ring," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "I bought it myself, you know. He never did give it to me. I bought it 3 weeks ago and put it on and told myself it was just a matter of time," she smiled. "A small, sad, entirely private thing. Perhaps I should have simply waited." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. They heard the motor on the street before Crane's constable knocked at the door. Chapter 12. After the leaves. The elm trees on Maple Street had shed their last leaves by the Tuesday after the arrest. May and the November sky came down flat and white over the village of Thornwick-on-Green. Mrs. Dorothea Pembleton's knee was almost entirely recovered. Another week, the doctor had said, which Dorothea interpreted as license to resume all normal activity immediately, and she and Miss Marple sat in the bay window with their tea in the early afternoon and watched the street resume itself. Mrs. Dolly Fenn had returned to number 11 with, as Miss Marple understood it, the very real possibility that the Holt estate, now in the hands of solicitors pending probate and the question of beneficiaries, might not pursue the redevelopment plans, at least not in the near term. Mrs. Fenn had sent over a fresh walnut cake that morning, covered in cloth, with a note written in the large, a plain handwriting of someone whose goodness is entirely unself-conscious. Miss Marple had eaten 2 slices and declared it excellent. Dr. Leonard Ashby was, as of Monday, also assisting the police with their inquiries. The question of what, precisely, he had or had not introduced to the brandy decanter on Thursday afternoon remained at this stage a matter for forensic analysis. Miss Marple's view, offered to Inspector Crane in the same measured, uninsistent tone she used for all her views, was that Ashby had placed the duplicate key in the decanter stopper notch on a previous occasion, had reconnoitred the house on Thursday with genuine intention, and had at the critical moment pulled back or been interrupted. Whether this constituted attempted murder or merely the contemplation of it was, she acknowledged, a matter for the courts. His performance with the left hand was, in any case, not likely to have been the behaviour of a man with nothing on his conscience. Peter Vane had gone back to Sheffield on Sunday morning, having spoken briefly with the solicitors, and received the news that his uncle's estate was a more complex matter than anyone had previously understood, and that resolution was some months away. Miss Marple had met him at the station, quite by chance, and they had stood for a moment on the platform. "Will it be all right?" he asked. He did not specify what he meant by it, and Miss Marple understood that he probably meant several things at once. "I think it will be a great deal more straightforward than it appears at present," she said. "These things usually are with time." He boarded his train, and she had watched it go with the mild, as unsentimental affection she felt for young people who were trying to be decent in difficult circumstances, which was, in her observation, a much larger category than the world generally gave credit for. Irene Clay had been taken to Thornwick Police Station on Sunday evening. The contents of the decanter, and the residue found in a small sealed vial recovered from a crack in the floorboards, of the number 5 airing cupboard, had told the chemical story with precise and unambiguous clarity. The duplicate key, carefully retrieved from the shed soil, bore a partial print consistent with a woman's finger. The navy umbrella had been matched to a purchase receipt found in Irene's bureau, dated 6 months prior, long before she had any apparent reason to own such an umbrella, which suggested, as Miss Marple had suspected, that the plan had been in formation for some time. The marriage had not, in the end, been an impulsive act. The doubt had been, and the plan had preceded it. Mrs. Pembleton poured more tea and looked at her friend with the comfortable, long-acquainted affection of someone who has known a person across several decades and no longer feels the need to express admiration in words. "You always find the small thing," she said. "One looks for the small things," Miss Marple replied. "The large things are usually where everyone else is already looking, and there are quite enough people for that." She picked up her knitting, the cable stitch, which was coming along nicely. "It is the small things that tell the truth. A wet umbrella on a dry day, a ring bought by its own wearer. A left hand used to demonstrate what the right hand had not quite done. And Mrs. Fenn's cake was innocent all along." "Mrs. Fenn's cake was entirely innocent," Miss Marple confirmed. "As I suspected from the beginning, a woman who would poison a cake for general consumption at a street supper would have to be both reckless and indifferent to the lives of the other people there. Mrs. Fenn was neither. She was frightened and angry and decent, which is a perfectly ordinary combination for a woman of 62 who's about to lose her home. She looked out at Maple Street, where a child was sweeping leaves from the pavement in front of number 9, and a cat was sitting on the wall in front of number 7 with the composure of a creature that has outlasted all relevant drama. "I am always," she said, rather more interested in the person who is not suspected than in the person who is. "The obvious suspect is never without use. They focus everyone else's attention so usefully. But it is the person standing just outside that circle of suspicion, watching, who tends to be worth examining most carefully." "Will you come again next October?" Mrs. Pembleton asked. "For the street supper?" Miss Marple smiled at the cat on the wall. "I think," she said, "that next October I shall simply enjoy the supper." There are, Miss Marple had often reflected, 2 kinds of endings to a crime. There is the official ending, the one written down in reports, spoken in courtrooms, and accepted by society as a neat conclusion. Names are attached to actions, motives are simplified into digestible phrases, and justice, in its formal attire, thus declares the matter resolved. And then there is the real ending, the one that lingers quietly in the hearts of those who remain. Thornwick-on-Green, in the weeks that followed, seemed to return to its gentle rhythms with remarkable efficiency. The postman resumed his rounds without pause. Mrs. Fenn's garden continued to bloom stubbornly despite the advancing cold, and the shop windows along the high street displayed early Christmas goods with a determined cheerfulness. Yet beneath this surface calm, something had shifted. Miss Marple noticed it in the way conversations paused ever so slightly when certain names were mentioned, in the way neighbours looked at one another, not with suspicion, but with a new awareness, as though they had collectively remembered that even the most familiar faces could carry hidden burdens. She sat, as she often did in Mrs. Pembleton's bay window, her knitting resting lightly in her hands. The yarn slipped through her fingers with practised ease, though her mind was elsewhere. "Do you think she meant to do it from the beginning?" Mrs. Pembleton asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Miss Marple did not look up at once. She considered the question with care, as she always did. "No," she said gently, "I do not think so." Mrs. Pembleton frowned slightly. "But the umbrella, the key, the vial." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The means were prepared, but means are not the same as intent." She set her knitting aside. "There is a moment," she continued softly, "in many lives, where a person stands at a crossroads. One path leads to patience, to endurance, perhaps even to disappointment. The other leads to something quicker, or more decisive, and far more dangerous." She glanced out the window where the pale afternoon light lay quietly across Maple Street. "I believe Miss Clay stood at such a moment, and she chose." Mrs. Pembleton sighed. "All that for money?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Not only money, security, fear, pride, perhaps even a kind of wounded hope." She paused. "A person who has built their future upon another's promise is in a very precarious position. When that promise begins to falter, she folded her hands in her lap. The ground beneath them can feel as though it is giving way entirely. There was a long silence after that. Inspector Crane, for his part, had concluded the matter with commendable thoroughness. The evidence had aligned cleanly. The narrative had been accepted. And the machinery of justice had moved forward with its usual steady momentum. Dr. Ashby's involvement, however, remained a quieter, more complicated matter. It was eventually determined that while he had indeed contemplated the act, and had taken preliminary steps toward it, he had not administered the fatal dose. His guilt, therefore, existed in a shadowed space between thought and action, a place the law addressed with careful distinction. Miss Marple found no satisfaction in this. She had seen such things before, the way resentment, left to mature unchecked, could curdle into something dangerous. The way a man, outwardly respectable, could justify to himself the most dreadful intentions if given enough time and solitude. It was, she thought, a reminder that wrongdoing did not always begin with a single decisive act. More often, as it began quietly, with a thought entertained once too often. As for Peter Vane, his letters arrived occasionally at Mrs. Pembleton's house, written in a neat, slightly hurried hand. He spoke of Sheffield, of work, of small advancements and modest hopes. There was in his words a careful determination, the kind that grows not from expectation but from necessity. Miss Marple read them with quiet approval. "He will be all right," she said one afternoon, handing the letter back. "You always say that," Mrs. Pembleton replied. "And I'm usually correct," Miss Marple said mildly. The house at number 7 remained empty for some time. Its windows, once warmly lit in the evenings, now reflected only the grey sky and the bare branches of the elm trees. There were discussions, of course, about its future, about ownership, about what should be done with it. But for a while it simply stood, still, watching. Miss Marple found herself looking at it often during her walks. There was something about empty houses, she thought, that held on to their histories more stubbornly than people did, as though the walls themselves remembered. On her final morning in Thornwick-on-Green, Miss Marple took a slow walk down Maple Street. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. A child laughed. Life, she observed, had resumed. And yet... She paused briefly outside the garden of number 7. The shed door had been properly closed now. The soil, once marked by a single careless impression, had been disturbed and smoothed over. The key, once hidden, was now evidence, categorized, labelled, removed from the quiet anonymity it had once enjoyed. Such small things, such decisive consequences. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and continued walking. At the station, Mrs. Pembleton fussed in the gentle, affectionate manner of someone who did not quite wish to say goodbye. "You will write, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple said, "and come again. I should like that very much." The train arrived with its usual punctual indifference. There was a brief exchange of final words, a warm clasp of hands, and then Miss Marple took her seat by the window. As the train began to move, Thornwick-on-Green slipped gradually from view. The rooftops, the trees, the quiet streets. Another village, another story, another reminder. Miss Marple rested her hands in her lap and allowed her eyes to close for a moment. There were those, she knew, who believed that evil was something extraordinary, something that arrived with noise and spectacle, easily recognized and swiftly condemned. But that had never been her experience. No, in her experience, evil was often quite ordinary. It lived in small decisions, in quiet fears, in the delicate, almost invisible turning points where a person chose one path over another. And yet, so too did goodness. In Mrs. Fenn's kindness, in Peter Vane's honesty, in Mrs. Rudge's quiet integrity. The balance, Miss Marple thought, was always there. One simply had to know where to look. The train gathered speed, carrying her away from Thornwick-on-Green, and all it had revealed. Miss Marple opened her eyes, a faint, thoughtful smile touching her lips. "Yes," she murmured softly to herself, "next October I shall simply enjoy the supper." And with that, she turned her gaze to the passing countryside, peaceful, unassuming, and full, as always, of stories waiting to be understood.